Hey everybody, I'm nutritionist Dr. Mike Roussell, and welcome to this edition of the Dr. Mike Show. Today we're going to dig into a little bit about ultra-processed foods. And I think ultra-processed foods are really interesting, and if you've gone through the minimally processed food challenge, which we're going to be launching again for some people, you'll know that it isn't as clear-cut as you may think it is, but there are some key things that we want to look out for when it comes to ultra-processed foods, and that directly is going to be able to impact our eating behaviors, the calories that we're eating, how full we feel, and also some of our food habits. So tune in and we're going to dive in a little bit deeper. Hey everybody, I'm nutritionist Dr. Mike Roussell, and welcome to this edition of the Dr. Mike Show. Today we're going to dig into a little bit about ultra-processed foods. And I think ultra-processed foods are really interesting, and if you've gone through the minimally processed food challenge, which we're going to be launching again for some people, you'll know that it isn't as clear-cut as you may think it is, but there are some key things that we want to look out for when it comes to ultra-processed foods, and that directly is going to be able to impact our eating behaviors, the calories that we're eating, how full we feel, and also some of our food habits. So tune in and we're going to dive in a little bit deeper. So when we talk about ultra-processed foods, it is kind of a complicated and I would say misunderstood landscape. You'll definitely hear people say that they only eat whole foods and they don't want to eat any junk food, they don't eat processed foods, and processed foods has a real negative connotation in a lot of scenarios. But one of the things that is important to appreciate, and in the minimally processed food challenge, which we'll link up in the show notes, is that there are a lot of really good processed and ultra processed foods. So not all processed and ultra processed foods are bad. Protein powder, for example, is a extremely useful tool for so many people in meeting their protein needs, accelerating recovery from hard training, getting in quality protein directly after exercise, and it's an ultra processed food. If you think that by definition, kind of the easy definition of ultra processed foods is it is a food that you could not make in your kitchen. Not due to your lack of culinary skills, but due to the lack of the technical equipment required to make that food. So even synthesis, which is one of the least processed of protein powders that you're going to find, and I say that from the other additives and things that are found in the product, that it's very minimal. There's a very short ingredient list, and people, I kind of stay away from the term, but people call it very clean. People have said to us, the ingredient list on synthesis is very clean, but it's still an ultra processed food. I could never make whey protein isolate and micellar casein in my kitchen, right? I don't have the equipment. I couldn't mix and create this. So that's a really simple definition to say, well, what is an ultra processed food? It's something that you can't make in your kitchen because you lack the industrial components. Now, the downside of, before we talk downsides, let's talk about the upsides of ultra processed foods. Ultra processed foods, the upsides are they're generally shelf stable, so they can last a long time. Protein powder, for example, can last 2 years, right, is the expiration date on most protein powders. Kind of just standard. It actually could probably last longer than that, but standard is 2 years. If you have, for example, chicken, that's going to last in your refrigerator maybe not even a week, right? If you freeze it, it can last a lot longer. But then that brings us to the other benefit of ultra-processed foods, which is portability, right? So many ultra-processed foods are good shelf stable, so they don't need to be refrigerated due to some of the process that they'll undergo. Now, some ultra processed foods, they do need to be refrigerated, they do need to be frozen. I think frozen pizza is another great traditional kind of example for ultra processed foods that I like to use. And one of the things about that kind of class of ultra processed foods is it's frozen. You can heat it up or in the in the oven, and it comes out like a pretty good looking pizza. And I think now you might say, whoa, Dr. Mike, like no frozen pizza is good. I'm like, okay, no frozen pizza is as good as a really good pizza. However, if you think about everything that goes into getting a frozen pizza to your house, when you pull it out and you put it in the oven and you take it out, it's pretty amazing that is the state in which it is in, and that's the taste and the mouthfeel and all those things, that it could have been frozen for a year before it got to you, and it was manufactured by the tens of thousands, and it tastes the way it does. So ultra-processed foods do have a huge convenience factor. And through the creation of processed and ultra-processed foods, part of it was, how do we meet food needs that we have, and really kind of the requirements that people are putting upon our food supply. The only reason, if you think of all these food franchises out there, which pretty much serve processed and ultra-processed foods almost exclusively, it's been due to the drive and the request of customers to have a consistently tasting food product that was cooked relatively quickly and available pretty much wherever they are. Nowadays I'm always amazed when I'll travel and I'll go speak at seemingly random locations throughout the country. I can always find basically the same restaurants that I find around where I live here outside of Rochester, New York. And that scale and consistency of our food supply is pretty amazing. I personally try not to go to those places. I like to find places that more of the mom and pop kind of restaurants, the places where they're making the food there. There's kind of this nuance and kind of love around the food that's being prepared, and it's less about efficiency, taste consistency, and speed and price. But all those things exist for a really good reason, and I think that there's a great place for them in our food supply. The consistency, I'll use the example of synthesis again. Being able to have high quality protein that tastes very, consistent, scoop to scoop, bag to bag of synthesis, that is at a really affordable price, considering that it is, the Porsche of protein powders, is amazing, and that's only due to our food supply. So there is a lot that's really good about ultra-processed foods. The downsides of ultra-processed foods is they're very easy to consume. Now, generally here we'll move out of the kind of the protein powder realm as we start looking at other examples. We can look at frozen pizzas, or we can look at some of these ultra processed foods that you'll find. Basically any kind of fast food sandwich, would fall under this category. The amount of calories that is in these foods is significantly higher than what you would expect if you were to make it yourself. And so there is this additional, caloric load. But there's also a taste to it that you can't replicate in your own kitchen. And that goes to part of it. So part of the ultra-processed food world is not just that you can't make it, because I can't make whey protein isolate in my kitchen, but I also don't have the flavor systems and the flavor enhancers that go into a lot of these ultra-processed foods. So if you're going to go to a fast food restaurant and you're going to have a chicken sandwich, or you're going to have a burger, or you're going to have French fries, or even some places you're going to have a burrito. It's not necessarily just burgers and sandwiches and fries, but other kinds of cuisine nowadays. You literally you can't make food that delicious from a flavor and taste perspective, because they've been engineered at such a level that it literally stimulates your brain that this is amazing, I need more of this. Now, it is salt and fat, but it is also flavor enhancers. And one of the downsides then is that your brain is kind of getting all these signals about taste and flavor, and that becomes the expectation. And then you go and eat quote unquote regular food, or what I would call minimally processed food, which in the food processing spectrum includes unprocessed foods and then minimally processed foods. When you go and eat those foods, they can taste bland. I mean, point blank. There's no way you can make lentils as flavorful as some of these other foods that you would go out and get at a fast food or kind of a fast casual place. It just doesn't work. Or even a frozen food version, where it's a frozen meal and it has the flavors and preservatives in it, that really make it delicious. You just can't do that. And so what happens is it creates an unreasonable expectation at your palate level about what food should taste like. So then when you go eat more minimally processed foods, what I would consider more kind of wholesome not being like a holier than thou, but wholesome as in nutrient dense, not calorie dense type foods, they're just blander. So for example, probably 2, maybe 3 years ago, I made a significant effort to cut down the sodium in my diet. I think when you look at the data on sodium consumption and blood pressure and the kind of health benefits, and you weigh the benefits versus the risks, a lower sodium diet, in my opinion, is a much better diet to consume. And fortunately, something less than 7% of the sodium in our diets comes from the salt shaker at the table. So it's not salting the foods, but it's food processing, it's eating out, it's ordering in, and it's all these other processed and ultra-processed foods. So processing, like when a food is processed, by definition, you're going to add fat or salt or sugar to it as a flavor enhancer or a preservative. So when you cut out all those foods and you start cooking with a lot less sodium, food legitimately doesn't taste good. People like salt for a reason, because it makes food taste really good. And so you have to start relying on other components in your diet, herbs, spices, and also just the overall quality of your food in order to get that better taste and flavor. But what happens over time is if you can kind of stick with this low sodium approach, and when I'm talking low sodium, I'm talking less than 1,500 milligrams of sodium, usually less than 1,000 milligrams of sodium per day. So a very, very low sodium diet. That over time, your palate starts to adjust and it starts to appreciate food in that current state without a lot of salt and without a lot of, kind of those extra flavors. And then that becomes normal, and it's really enjoyable. I use a lot of hot sauce, and now if I'll taste and we'll go and we'll eat out, or I'll eat some other food that maybe someone else has prepared and it has a quote unquote normal level of sodium in it, I find it to be so salty and then almost not enjoyable. So our palates adapt, and if you eat a lot of ultra processed foods, your palates adapt to have this expectation of that salt and flavor and richness, kind of a hyper flavor to your foods. So then when you start eating other foods that aren't ultra processed, there's something lacking from that flavor perspective, and the food just doesn't taste as good, and so you're drawn back to that. I think oftentimes when people will say, well, ultra processed foods or fast foods or prepared foods are addictive, I think addictive is a really strong word, especially when people go, in my opinion, crazy and talk about how it stimulates the same, reward centers in your brain as drugs like cocaine and things like that. There are a lot of things that can stimulate reward centers in your brain, but I think drawing the analogy to a highly addictive drug like cocaine is irresponsible and untrue. So it's not that level of addiction, but there is a yearning for that flavor and that taste that is really good. And so when you eat a lot of ultra-processed foods, you get used to that, and then you're drawn to those foods. When you start moving more on the unprocessed and minimally processed side, even if you choose not to go very low sodium like I do with my own diet, if you go to that side, it takes time for your palate to adapt. But in a couple weeks, then you basically are adapted, and that becomes the food and the taste and the flavors that you really enjoy. So if you can take the time to make that transition over to more minimally processed foods that aren't artificially and ultra flavored, you'll start enjoying that food a lot more. I'm not saying that kale or baby spinach tastes as good as French fries from Five Guys, not a chance. But there's different levels of enjoyment that you can have with your food, and it's just how do you get past that sticking point initially of dealing with those kind of, it's blander. There's no way around it. I'm trying to think of a way to sugarcoat it, for lack of a better term, but you're not able to. It's blander food, so you need to add more herbs, you need to add more spices. I often say, it was kind of when I counsel people when they're going to go on a low carb or ketogenic diet, not to cut calories. So I think it's a mistake if you cut carbs and cut calories simultaneously. You're basically taking two legs of the stool, of this three-legged stool, away from your body. So now you're at a calorie deficit, which is miserable, and your body is getting no carbs, which is also miserable. So you're suffering double misery. There's no need to do that, right? Cut carbs, but also generally still eat in a way that you feel full and satisfied. And then as your body starts to adapt to this lower carbohydrate environment, then you can start purposefully cutting back calories. So I recommend the same thing for people who are moving from a more ultra-processed diet to a minimally processed diet is don't go minimally processed and low sodium and purposely cut calories. Like, though it's just too much. Salt your food when you're preparing it in a way that you feel good about. Add as much kind of additional low sugar seasonings as you can at first, and then you slowly kind of wean yourself off of it as your palate starts to change and adapt. But whatever you're going to be able to add at the plate is not nearly going to be as intensive from a flavor perspective as you're going to get from an ultra-processed food. So it's a net positive change, because what we're really looking for is permanent change, not I'm going to cut out these easy to eat, somewhat addictive ultra-processed foods for a week and then eat minimally processed foods and then I'm going to go back. We don't want that, right? So let's find a more reasonable approach. Common sense goes a long way with your nutrition. I was just preparing a talk for a group in China about fueling for people with diabetes post-exercise. And the first message of that part of the presentation was common sense, which is the same message that I give to a lot of my athletes. If you worked out for 20 minutes, you don't need 4 stages of post-exercise fueling. You probably just need a glass of water and then eat a reasonable meal afterwards. But if you've trained for 2 hours, you might need liquid carbs, liquid electrolytes, and a recovery shake right afterwards, and then another meal not too long after that. So common sense goes a long way. And when we're looking at food processing and should we eat these ultra processed foods or should we eat minimally processed foods, swearing off ultra processed foods entirely I think is a mistake. And what you can do is just wean yourself off and find the ones that are useful. That's really one of the core components of the minimally processed food challenge, is making that movement to minimally processed foods, but then also appreciating ultra processed foods that have good utility. Protein bars are another example. A lot of times, and a lot of this centers around protein because protein needs to be cooked, it needs to be refrigerated, it has a shorter shelf life, but ultra processed foods allow us greater protein leverage. For example, I must have threw away, but I had here on my desk earlier. Oh, here it is. I was drinking a slate milk, right? And so this, very similar to Fairlife milk, right? It's an ultra filtered milk, so it filters out some of the carbohydrates and the sugars, the lactose naturally found in milks, and it concentrates the protein, so you get significantly more protein. Again, it uses industrial techniques you could never mimic in your kitchen, but it also has great utility in your life if you're trying to meet your certain protein needs and goals. So finding these ultra-processed foods that are useful is really important. The other place that we can get in trouble with ultra-processed foods, and this goes kind of with what we were talking about with that taste and flavor perspective, is that research shows that on a per bite basis and a calories consumed per minute basis, when you consume ultra-processed foods, you're eating more calories per minute and more calories per bite than if you had these minimally or unprocessed food counterparts. So it just makes it a lot easier to consume these calories. And now there are some people, right? If you're an athlete who trains a lot, or if you're, a middle school or high school student or a college athlete who is just growing and your body needs more calories and you're burning a lot of calories, you need to leverage some of these foods that are easier to consume more calories per minute. But for most of us, consuming less calories per bite and less calories per minute is going to be a huge benefit, because we're always thinking, how do we conserve and control the calories that we consume? So it's important to appreciate that with ultra-processed foods, it's a lot easier to overconsume calories than if we were eating the minimally processed counterparts. We can take that one step further, where in ultra-processed foods and processed foods, the fibers are generally taken away from these carbohydrate-based foods and broken down such that they're much easier to consume. I remember talking, I think it was one of the episodes of the Dr. Mike Show. I had Michael Easter on, and we were talking about this because in his new book, Scarcity Brain, he talks a lot about ultra processed foods, and he quotes me some of that part of those, some sections in that book talking about ultra processed foods, that the ease of consumption and the lack of chewing is really noticeable. And so if you're eating ultra processed foods, they just literally don't require you chew as much. So you can just chew a little and then swallow, and you're on to the next one. And when you're on the minimally processed or unprocessed side of foods, it requires a lot more chewing. And if you have to chew more, that slows down the pace in which you're eating. It also helps enhance and optimize the digestive process, because when you chew, it actually causes your body to pre-release insulin. Chewing food is a signal to release insulin. So then by the time that food gets into your bloodstream, those carbohydrates gets into your bloodstream, there's already some insulin there helping control and buffer blood sugar levels. Digestion, if you chew enough, digestion can also start in the mouth, with some of those carbohydrates also being digested. So not chewing your food due to structural changes that are present in these ultra-processed foods is also one of the deficits that you get from consuming a diet that's high in ultra-processed foods. So hopefully what you're picking up from this conversation is there's a place for all kinds of foods in our diet, and there's a place for ultra-processed foods if we use them really strategically, but most of our diet should be minimally processed or unprocessed foods. And that it is a tough shift to make, because especially if you eat more processed and ultra processed foods, your palate is expecting and used to a certain flavor profile that plain brown rice, yams, grilled steak, it's just not going to deliver. And so you need to give yourself some time to transition over and have your palate adapt. But if you can have that patience, you're going to be rewarded with being able to eat a much larger volume of food. It's going to feel like you're eating a lot more calories, and there's going to be a lot more nutrition, a lot more nutrients. And, in the long run, it's going to be a lot better for you than leveraging just these ultra processed foods. And, when you compare it all, and I was talking about this in some of the Nutrition OS, which is a nutrition certification that I put together. Calories, I was talking with the people in the certification about this. Calories matter. So yes, if you chose to eat just ultra processed foods, and you see this all the time, people say, I'm going to eat Chick-fil-A every day for 30 days. I'm not going to gain any weight. You can totally do that, right? Especially because Chick-fil-A is closed on Sundays, so you got to fast all day on Sunday, right? But you could totally do that if you control calories. But it's just harder to control calories if you eat a diet with more ultra-processed foods than a diet that's primarily unprocessed foods and minimally processed foods, because those types of calories are innately easier and faster to consume. So it's not good or bad. It's just, do you want to choose the easier path that requires less self-discipline, or do you want to try the harder path, which requires more self-discipline? So if you're going to eat more ultra-processed foods, it's just going to require more discipline and maybe feeling a little bit more hungry than the other way. So you can choose either, but I'm going to send people to the path that requires less self-discipline and allows them to feel like they're eating more food, even though they're going to consume less calories. So hopefully you'll see, when you think about this and you hear people demonize ultra-processed foods or processed foods in general, that there's good and bad to both, and that it's really about how do we create a foundation of unprocessed and minimally processed foods, and then also use ultra-processed foods as necessary. All right, so that's going to wrap it up for this episode of the Dr. Mike Show. I appreciate everybody tuning in, and if you're on the Dr. Mike email list, you can get on by going to mikeroussell.com. If you do that, you'll be getting an email soon about the new and next round of the Minimally Processed Food Challenge. I hope to see you on the inside.